Guy here with a quick message before we get on with the pod. As a thank you to our most dedicated and loyal viewers and listeners to Blood Red, we're inviting you to join our Blood Red Club. By joining, you'll get access to insider transfer content as well as interviews with former favourites and those connected at Anfield. All you need to do is head to bloodredpodcast.co.uk, enter your email address, and our exclusive content will head to your inbox. That's bloodredpodcast.co.uk. Thanks. Now on with the show.
And welcome once again to the Liverpool.com podcast. My name is Mo Stewart, I'm your host, and it's a miserable day here in the city of Liverpool, but my spirits are lifted slightly by the two men I see in front of me, Matt Addison and James Martin, and also by the subjects of today's podcast. Now, Curtis Jones is someone who I've always been kind of fascinated by, I must admit, but considering he's had his first two appearances of the season within this week, and he crowned one of them with a goal, it feels like a really good time to kind of take a deeper dive into his current status as a Liverpool player, work out maybe his pecking order within the squad, his place within the team, and the kind of ambitions he should have beyond. So, Matt, I'll start with you. Let's rewind it back to the beginning of the season. In fact, before the season even started, and the injury he picked up in the final pre-season game. Now, at that point, we already knew that there was going to be some places missing in Liverpool central midfield because of the guys coming back early from the summer tournaments. We know what Curtis is like in terms of his belief in himself. He would have been targeting those games. It was a massive blow for him to be able to miss out on it, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was. And I think it was compounded a lot as well by the injury, or rather the emergence before the injury to Harvey Elliott. I think obviously people's attentions switch very, very quickly as soon as there's one wonder kid, another one. There's, talk of the next Harvey Elliott and Cade Gordon's come through, and things can change very quickly. And I don't think personally that played really into Curtis Jones's hands, just in terms of the perception of him. Obviously, Jurgen Klopp and Pep Lijnders and all the rest of it will know exactly what they've got on their hands. But yeah, he's a really important player, and one that I think it's still sort of up in the air what his long-term position is, but I think obviously the fact that they tried to mould him a little bit into being Gini Wijnaldum sort of protege type thing, I think is a kind of good sign of what's going to happen, at least for this season. I think that's sort of one eye on sort of replacing the minutes of him. And yeah, the injury was unfortunate, but it was only a short-term one. And obviously, as I say, perceptions change very quickly. Yeah. I think we've now kind of seen that he's going to get minutes. He's going to get chances. I'd be surprised if he didn't start at least one of the next two games. Obviously, then it's an international break. But yeah, the injury to Thiago has probably benefited him more than anybody else, to be honest.
Yeah, and that's the irony of the situation. And it's an injury that took him out, and it's an injury that might well bring him back in. But I want to concentrate a little bit more on what Matt was talking about in terms of perception, James, because yes, within the confines of Kirby, he'll know exactly what the managers and the coaches think of him. He'll still have that belief. But seeing the way, as Matt mentioned, Elliott came in and hit the ground running, and he became the man everyone was talking about. His future place was projected. And let's not forget, he'd come from what we'd expected him to be in a forward position into Curtis's backyard of the midfield. It can't have been easy for him to keep calm while he was seeing Harvey going out there winning 9 out of 10s and man of the matches every week.
Yeah, I mean, it's the nature of the beast, isn't it? Like, you're in a team like Liverpool, who's won the Champions League, the Premier League in the last few seasons. There's always going to be competition, whether that's from a big name who comes in the transfer market, or whether it's from a kind of more unexpected source. And as you say, a very kind of repositioned youngster who we all thought, like you say, we're thinking, yeah, perfect. He'll get minutes when Salah's rested. He can, pick up the odd start in the African Cup of Nations when Salah's away with that. And of course, it turned out very differently. Yeah, I suppose the thing, because it's with such an unexpected source, it might maybe have thrown Jones off a little bit more than if someone had come in and it would have been like, right, okay, that's my competition. That's the one I'm aiming at. But equally, it's nice that Curtis Jones can have that sort of mentor role in a way, like because I mean, as such a young player, you don't normally associate that with him. But then, I mean, he was right there straight away on in the comments and stuff on Instagram when Elliott suffered the injury setback. He's clearly trying to look out for him, and it's just it's that kind of natural progression, really, in the sense that he'll want Elliott to do well as much as everyone else in the squad. He'll be rooting for him. I don't think his thought process will really be, right, that's my place, he's nicked. It'll be, this is my potential future midfield partner. You know, I mean, they're 20 and 18 or something respectively. So when you look at who's ahead of them currently, you've got, Thiago wrong side of 30, Henderson's the wrong side of 30, Keita is the wrong side of injured. So yeah, there'll be opportunities for both of them. It's not an either or.
No, that's an interesting point. You're right, actually. He probably is looking at the other end of the age spectrum for his competition. But you mentioned the transfer window. Obviously, when Gini left, there was lots of talk about Liverpool replacing him with someone, and the fact that they didn't being an issue. Obviously, Matt, Curtis would have seen that as an opportunity. But I do think, and most of us do think, that Liverpool will still bring a midfielder in within the next 2 windows, I think it's fair to say. With Curtis, do you think his attitude towards it is more a case of, I'm going to keep John Henry's checkbook in his pocket by how well I play, or is he more laying down a marker so his place in the pecking order before any new man comes in?
I think it's very much the latter. As you say, you'd expect Liverpool to get another body in at some point. As James mentioned, they've got to sort of address that imbalance in terms of the age. You've got the very young and the obviously at the opposite end of the spectrum, James Milner, and then a little bit below him, Jordan Henderson and Thiago. So there's not really too much in the middle. The ones in the middle are kind of Keita and Oxlade-Chamberlain, come with kind of question marks of their own. So there is definitely scope for at least one midfielder, I would imagine, to come in probably next summer rather than in January. But it's an interesting one of where he fits in. I think for me, I'd still have one eye on playing him in the front three long term. I just think that's where he's best. He's most creative. We've seen the goals that he scored. We've seen creativity, the ability to dribble and hold the ball up. He can do a kind of Sadio Mane type role on that left-hand side if he needs to. Obviously, slightly different type of player and that sort of thing. But I think he is slightly wasted when you bring him, all the way back and take that away from, the creativity of him. Having seen him a fair bit when he was coming through the academy at Liverpool, it's like a different player when you watch him now. It's really strange, and he is very good as a midfielder. He's very good at doing that Wijnaldum type thing. He's obviously got the footballing intelligence to be able to do that, but I do think there's a little bit more scope to get a little bit more out of him going the other way. So be interesting to see sort of where it lies. For me, long term, it's probably a case of slightly more in the front three, slightly less in the midfield, but obviously to have the ability to do both, just like Harvey Elliott, it's probably not the worst thing to be able to get minutes. If they need a midfielder, he can play there. If they need a forward, well, he can play there as well.
It is an interesting conundrum, though, isn't it, James? Because, as Matt mentioned, when you're a young player, you're very much just trying to get in where you can fit in. Any minutes are good minutes, and just trying to prove to the manager you can do a job. But the reality is that the most eye-catching parts of his recent performances have been in the final third. And it's an issue that we've seen with a lot of English's young creative midfielders at the moment, where you see some of them are playing as forwards, some of them are playing central midfielders, and you wonder which is going to be their best position. We saw against Norwich with Curtis that he was actually starting a lot more withdrawn. He was almost like a number 6. And it was an interesting performance because I thought he played very well. But to listen to Jurgen Klopp after the game, it was almost as if he didn't really give him what he wanted. I mean, what are your thoughts on what Matt was saying about him ending up in the forward line? Where do you think his best position will ultimately be?
It's a tricky one. And I think you're right to draw parallels to a lot of the young English players coming through at the moment. I think the problem is they're basically all number 10s in a football world where number 10 doesn't even really exist anymore. So, yeah, you've just kind of got to pick your poison, because if you put them on the wing, then you lose that some element of their kind of ability to dictate the play. You lose that kind of metronomic role, and those kind of occasional number 10-esque defence splitting passes. But again, they're harder to come by these days, just in terms of how oppositions are setting up. But they're still, you'll still see them from time to time. It reminds me a lot of the Coutinho conundrum in terms of where you want to play him. Do you want to stick him out on the wing or try him in the middle? And there's pros and cons attached to both. I think I'd be surprised if Curtis Jones ended up in the front three. I see what Matt's saying, and he watched him a lot more than I did in terms of the youth teams. And yeah, I mean, I've heard only good things about what he did in that more advanced role coming through the system. But in terms of the senior side, as again Matt touched upon, he's such a different player to someone like a Mane. It would require a pretty radical change. If we did see it, I think it would probably be in a post-Klopp world, which, I mean, Jones, you'd have to expect will be around for that. So that's not to say it won't happen, but I think we would be looking quite a long way down the line. For the time being, I think, that kind of Wijnaldum Air sort of situation is what we'll be looking at. And yeah, with the Norwich game, that was an odd one. I mean, he's not a number 6, is he? Like, I mean, we can quibble over whether he's a number 8 or a winger. He's definitely not a defensive midfielder. And yeah, you're right. It did look like he was doing quite well. He was influencing the game. But on the flip side of that, when he moved further forward and Tyler Morton came in as the number 6, we looked a lot more secure. And, this is someone with his, having his first taste of senior football. And he made things look a lot more safe at the back than when we were trying Curtis Jones there. So, yeah, I mean, I don't really want to see that experiment too many times.
Well, I feel like it puts him in a really difficult position because you've got him kind of fighting against his natural creative instincts. And as a young player coming into a team, having the discipline to be able to do the team job over being able to maybe highlight what you can do, it's always going to be that hardest part of maturing, Matt. And I think we've kind of made mention of Curtis's attitude and his confidence and the fact that is really a good thing the majority of the time. Is it going to be something you think he's going to be battling against for like the most of his career in terms of having to hold himself back in certain situations, certain times, or is this just the growing pains that all young players go through?
I think it's a tough one to predict, to be honest. I think if you could get that balance between him doing what Wijnaldum does, but also having those flashes of creativity, I think that's something that Jurgen Klopp will have his eye on. It's just a case of whether he can take that step. I think he was very, very creative, didn't do much defending when he was a youngster. Now he's gone the other way. It's kind of like finding that perfect balance in the middle where he does the Wijnaldum role, but also the other bit, which I think is basically what Naby Keita should have been had he not been injured so much. So I think it is sort of the perfect position for him if he can do that. My worry would be that he just never quite has the ability and the ceiling to get to that level of being what is basically an impossible task in the midfield. To do everything all of the time is very, very hard. So not being able to get to that level is not to say that he can't become a really, really good footballer, and he already is a really good footballer. But I just think that's probably what Jurgen Klopp has got his eye on. If it comes together, if it's perfect, and if he's got the ceiling to be able to do it, it could be the absolute perfect Jurgen Klopp number 8, where he does a bit of everything. But it's just a case of, does he ever get to that point? And if not, that's where I think he will then move into the front three, because ultimately his attacking qualities are better than his defensive qualities. And if you can't have both, I'd probably go with the former.
I think that's a fair point. And something we probably kind of take for granted is how difficult it is to actually play midfield for Jurgen Klopp, because from the outside world, a lot of people will live or die by the numbers. They don't get enough goals. They don't get enough assists, blah, 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 blah. But we as Liverpool fans who watch the games in, week out, we know what they're doing. We know exactly how hard it is to do what they're doing. And I think for Curtis James, the fact that his role has shifted from week to week, sometimes in the middle of games, can it be a bit of an issue whereby he's being put in a position that does the best for the team, i.e., like Matt mentioned, when Naby's not around, he's been doing the Naby job, which was essentially the genie job, at the potential cost of his own development as a player within himself?
Yeah, it's a possibility, and one Klopp's going to be aware of, I think, and he'll definitely be keen to avoid that, because I mean, every coach wants the best for their young players, but Klopp in particular will be mindful that he won't want to hurt any of his players in pursuit of team success. He'll want team success as much as anyone, but he's not going to ask anyone to do something that's going to sacrifice their career in any way. But yeah, it's tough. I mean, I found myself semi-disagreeing with Matt more than ever before on one of these shows, I think. Normally we just say the exact same thing. But yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a comment on Curtis Jones that he can't do that sort of Wijnaldum unleashed role, because I don't think it really exists. I mean, was Brentford not kind of a Wijnaldum unleashed sort of role for him? And then look what happens. We concede 3. Like, it's impossible for someone to do all of that. That's why Wijnaldum would just have hardly any creative impact, and then he'd go away with the Netherlands and bang in a brace seemingly every time there was an international break. Like, if you let them off the chain, then they have the ability to affect the game going forward. But it's such a sort of defensive role. Like, calling it a number 8 doesn't really do it justice, because you think in your head it's like, oh, Fabinho's the defensive mid, so the other 2 can get forward. They'll be contributing going forward, but that's not their main role at all. They're almost like auxiliary fullbacks, because they're slotting in to protect Trent and to protect Robertson, who are bombing up the other way. The only sort of creative job they have is progressing the ball. So they'll take it from deep and they'll move it forward, and then they'll get rid of it. And it won't be the final pass before the goal. It'll be just something to get the ball rolling. I mean, in a literal sense, for starting off a move like that's. And yeah, if you want them to produce more in an attacking role, this is where I very much agree with Matt, is that you will have to stick him in the front line. That's the only way of doing it. I just don't think that's a Curtis Jones thing. I think that's a Liverpool midfield thing.
I mean, it might be. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, it sort of reminds me of Jude Bellingham when he decided that he wanted to be number 22. That was because his coaches said he should be a number 4, a number 8, and a number 10, 4 being what we would call the 6. And it's kind of like, well, yeah, you can't be all 3 at the same time. You do have to pick one ultimately, don't you?
You do. And I think that sometimes when you've got a talent profile like Bellingham, it's almost as if it kind of depends on the team he ends up with as to which it will be, where their space is. When you've got someone like Curtis, I feel like he wants that to be the case very much, so that he is able to develop in the same way. But we'll have to wait and see. I'm interested in the idea of the formation change as well, because one of the things that we haven't really discussed in terms of the development of him is the makeup of the team. Obviously, we're all still sitting here under the guise that we have a front 3 and we'll continue to have a front 3 for as long as they're there. But maybe as they start to get towards the end of their careers, that is an evolution of the side, that maybe we start looking at 2s, and maybe we start looking at maybe the kind of number 10-ish role that we didn't have in previous years, James. I know that very much the idea was that Klopp threw out the number 10 baby with the bathwater when he got rid of Coutinho. But do you think it's something that he can still play with? I mean, obviously he had the likes of Shinji Kagawa, his time with Borussia Dortmund, I think Mkhitaryan as well. So it's not like he hates all number 10s. It could be something in the future. Yeah,
and I mean, Goetze being the absolute archetypal Klopp number 10 back in the day. But yeah, I don't think it was necessarily a Coutinho baby in bathwater situation, in the sense that he wasn't even really getting played at number 10 by Klopp either. He would mostly be popping up on the wing. He'd sometimes be in the 8. But again, was he ever really in the 10? I associate that more with Brendan Rodgers, to be honest with you. But yeah, I'd like to see it tried again. I've even just looking away from Liverpool, I love that position in the game of football. Just aesthetically, it's pleasing to watch, and I understand that tactically things move on, and of course every manager is not going to care if it's looking nice as long as it's effective. So yeah, it's a question to be considered, and I think maybe with the kind of the way things have shifted towards, with so many sort of big teams versus small teams dynamics in all of the leagues across Europe, there are so many games where it's just low block against creative team. I do think maybe we'll see something of a resurgence in the 10, where you are trying to pack that middle of the park with creative players who can just kind of weave a way through, because it's the only way to break teams down. And in that case, maybe yeah, that's something Liverpool can try, and it's something that would work well for Curtis Jones. The trouble is, if there is that kind of resurgence, it's a big ask, because the whole thing with the number 10 traditionally is that they're the kind of moments of magic players who you do have to kind of carry, and then hope that they'll pull something out of the bag. So if it does come back into fashion, which I hope it does, because everyone loves those moments of magic, then you really do need to have a pretty special player in there. Otherwise, it's not going to work, particularly in a Klopp team. You just can't have passengers. So yeah.
I mean, I think most of us, as soon as you were talking about that, were considering a certain tall Frenchman who doesn't live a million miles away from here, and considering the kind of thing that Jurgen Klopp would do with him. And I think you're probably right. So let's think a bit more about the present day. Now, Kurt has made 34 appearances in all competitions last season, although the majority of them did come, well, they were in a couple of blocks, I think it's fair to say, towards the end of the season, Matt, when it looked like Liverpool had hit upon their stride and a little bit more of a settled side, he was kind of on the outside. Do you think, considering so many variables were involved in terms of how we do in those domestic cups and what the injury landscape looks like, do you think he should be setting himself appearance targets, or is it one of those things where he just needs to concentrate on what he does when he does get his chance?
I think he'll have a target in his head. I think the important thing to remember last season is, even though we didn't see a huge amount of him after March, he'd still played way more minutes than any of us thought he was going to heading into that season. So he'd still played probably twice as much as what even he could have expected at the start of the season. Even at the end, it was slightly frustrating for him to not get minutes, but he'd already played way in excess of what he would have imagined he would have been doing. So I think if he has a similar season this season, that'd be absolutely fine. I think obviously there's kind of a little bit of an expectation that he's one of the players that will help replace Gini Wijnaldum's minutes, but then you've got other players that will come back. Fabinho is now in midfield rather than defence. Thiago hopefully won't be as injury prone as what he was at times last season. So there's a few players, he is one of them, but it's not going to be a case of, I think Gini Wijnaldum played 52, 53 times last season. It's not going to be a case that all of those minutes suddenly go to one player. They're going to be spread out, and Curtis will be one of those. So yeah, I'd be surprised if he ends up playing less than what he did last season, but I don't think it's going to be massively more. I think it's going to be fairly similar, steady progress, impress, as you say, whenever he gets the opportunity, and wherever it is on the pitch, that'll be fine for him for his development. I think there was a few sort of knee-jerk reactions of people panicking that he's not going to get minutes. I think that the sort of injuries that we've seen over the past week or so have probably disproven that. So yeah, there'll be plenty of.
Well, I mean, availability might actually be his biggest and best quality this season, because that might be the thing that gets him in the team. The games where he probably is a lot more likely to expect to start are the domestic cups, James. And I've got this image in my mind of Curtis Jones wearing the armband, leading a young band to Wembley, winning a trophy, and using that momentum to kick on and really taking on the next phase of his Liverpool career. Am I just being fantastical? Do you think this could really be something that happens?
Well, I mean, I like the sound of it. Yeah, it's like I was touching on earlier in terms of that kind of unlikely role model function that he can have early in his career, because if his minutes do come in the domestic cups, then yeah, he will likely be one of the more experienced heads in there, not just in terms of age, but in terms of his senior minutes so far. Because as Matt said, he played a lot more than people were really expecting last season. He's got a lot of match experience in like proper competitive games under his belt. So yeah, and he's a difference maker as well. We saw it when he did play in the domestic cups last season. I think it might have been the season before, but the goal against Everton anyway. There's no reason why he couldn't lead us to a little bit of success in the domestic cups. We've got a nicer draw than usual in the next round of the EFL Cup, the Carabao Cup. So yeah, win that, and I think it's only 2 games from Wembley or something like that. It's not the longest of cup competitions, so yeah, I don't think it's totally within the realms of fantasy from you. It depends on the cup draw to some extent. If we come up against a City or something, if assuming we get past Preston, and then Klopp decides to put out a youth-oriented team again, then yeah, we're probably going to get played off the park. We have to be realistic about that. But yeah, with a couple of favourable draws and a couple of good performances on the days, then yeah, I mean, why not? And it would definitely be good for his progression in terms of taking on that responsibility and yeah, stepping up to the plate.
I'm always going to be optimistic about the future. I think that we do really have a chance in both domestic cups. When you consider the timing of the FA Cup, obviously in January, it's at a time we're going to have a couple of players away, obviously Naby Keita probably, as well as Salah and Mane. So that looks like the time for him to really kind of showcase himself, so to speak, Matt, doesn't it? Even if he gets to maybe Christmas time and he hasn't featured as much as he'd like, he'll probably be having some big red pen all around some fixes in January.
Yeah, that's what he needs, isn't it? To an extent, it's hard to make a case to put him in for a consistent 5-6 game spell. But I think if ever that's going to happen, it's going to be in January, isn't it? With a couple of players missing, lots of fixtures there. As James said, you'd fancy him to sort of captain a young side if there's a decent sort of Anfield game in the FA Cup. What was that? The first weekend of January, I think, isn't it? That's played. If you assume that Liverpool get through, then there's another one to look forward to. There's kind of there's an opportunity there, and I think it's something that he will look at, and that's to a certain degree why I think it'll be a similar season this season for him to last. I think we saw last season there was spells where he played a lot and then not so much in other bits. I think it's going to be similar. That January period is a classic example, but what you've got to hope and what he'll hope is that if he does get 5 or 6 games in a row, he impresses enough so that after those 5 or 6 games, he's not just thrown back out. It's a case of sort of rotating him in and keeping him in there on merit.
Definitely. And he's an ambitious young lad. We all know this. And I think that he has the ability to be able to go out and achieve those aims. So one final point I wanted to bring in, James. What kind of targets do you think he should be setting himself in terms of goals and assists? Because let's face it, the football landscape in 2021 is still dominated by those two numbers. If you really want to make an impact in people's minds, you need to be doing things along those lines. So, not bearing in mind we don't know how many appearances he's going to make, it does appear like his attacking instincts have increased. He's got off the mark against Brentford. How many do you think he can get over the course of a season?
It's so tricky because of what we were talking about earlier with Klopp's midfield. Like, they're just not the relevant targets. Like, assuming he stays as a number 8, Klopp won't care if he doesn't get any more goals or assists for the rest of the season if he puts in the kind of Wijnaldum-esque performances we were seeing. And I mean, obviously, we're going to look at his own spin on the role. We're not just asking him to be a Wijnaldum clone. There's things he could do better. There's things which he won't be able to do. But yeah, I don't think it's what he's in there to do if he stays in the role where Klopp's playing him at the moment. Like you say, even when he looks like he's doing well and is impacting things going forward, you get comments from the manager which seem to suggest that he's not been the happiest with how he's carried out the tactical instructions. So, I mean, I won't boycott your question because that seems a bit that seems a bit extreme. I'll give you an answer, but like him personally, he'll be setting the target. Maybe he'll want to get to maybe 5 league goals, and if he gets maybe 3 assists to go with it, he'll probably be happy enough with that, depending on game time, of course. But it's not going to be going crazy in terms of what he's looking for. But yeah, in terms of what Klopp wants from him, I don't think he'll be looking at those columns whatsoever. So yeah.
No, that is a very Jurgen answer, and I'm not gonna I'm not gonna poo-poo it simply for that reason. Now, Matt, as James mentioned previously, you have seen a lot more of him than us. You've seen him a long way through his progression from the early days. The chances are, despite what James says, he will be setting himself a target. Do you have an inkling of where do you think it should be, or where do you think it would be?
Well, knowing Curtis's character, I think his targets will be far higher than what James has put forward there. I think he'll no doubt have in his head an idea of goals, assists, games, minutes. He'll have it all mapped out. It's just a case of which position does he play the most in. If he plays in the front 3, then obviously those targets go up. If he plays in midfield, it's maybe less important. But I think to him, every single week that he's not in the team, he'll be gutted. Every single week that he doesn't score, he'll be gutted. That's just the kind of player that he is. And that was something that Liverpool's youth coaches worked a lot with him, actually, in his last season, or his last 2 seasons, really, of playing for the under-23s. There was 2 bits that they worked on. One was captaincy, and he was under-23s captain, and it was about leadership, and it was about not just you doing your game and playing really well, but how can you help the other players do really well, which I think is the perfect sort of midfield Gini Wijnaldum type role within a team. And the other thing was, goals and assists and making sure that it's not just flicks and tricks and step overs and stuff like that, which he'd always been brilliant at. It's a case of, well, are you doing that just to show off, or are you doing that so that you can generate a bit of space and find the back of the net? So it's two very big parts of his game, actually, that we've spoken about there in terms of leadership and numbers. He'll no doubt have very lofty ambitions that probably would be impossible to match this season. But I think, that there is a player in there that can score 10 goals a season at some point. Whether that's this season, not quite sure just yet.
Well, Curtis, if you're listening, I'm telling you, dream as big as you can. Seriously, there's absolutely nothing wrong with dreaming for the stars and not quite making it. I hope you are listening, because you'd have heard half an hour of us all bigging you up and projecting a fantastic future for you in the Liverpool midfield. Matt, James, I've enjoyed this very, very much. To all of you listening, I hope you have as well. We'll see you all again next week.